names and faces and unfamiliar ones, and I'm delighted by both. So the first 100 days of a presidency doesn't signify that much officially, other than being a nice round number. But there's a tradition that dates back to Franklin Roosevelt of using the first 100 days as a benchmark at which to evaluate what a president is doing and what the president's priorities are. It dates back to the early New Deal legislation during the first 100 days of FDR's first term. Congress passed 70 some pieces of legislation, 15 of which were really major. And at the end of the first 100 days, right after the 100-day mark, in one of his fireside chats, FDR mentioned to, taking time to reflect on what I've done in my first 100 days in office. And so ever since then, presidents who with a keen eye towards their historical legacy, like to compare their accomplishments to their predecessors, have similarly liked to try to achieve something in 100 days and have it be compared to the legendarily productive 100 days of FDR. Now, there's nothing about 100 days that is, official. It's not like anything that doesn't happen in 100 days won't happen, but I think it's a useful ritual for the public to take some time shortly after an election, when a lot of people kind of check out of politics, to check back into politics and see what's going on and see what the president's priorities are. Early in an administration isn't time to accomplish much, but it is time enough for a president to do some things unilaterally, to issue some executive orders and to try to fill political appointees in the executive branch, which signals pretty powerfully what their priorities are, what their goals are. And the first 100 days disproportionately consists of things that are directly under the president's control, as opposed to sources of compromise. So it's a good way to get to know a president and see what the administration is going to be like, or what the president hopes it will be like.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cayton. And I figured we could maybe jump in with a little bit more of a broadly focused question, maybe more of a simple question before we maybe get into some more specific questions, policy questions. So thinking about the first few months of the Biden presidency, obviously the 100 days is not quite over yet. And sort of thinking about the flow from the election last year, has anything thus far really surprised you about the administration, or is anything more or less pretty much going as you would have expected it to go? So anything sticking out to you so far?
I guess I'll go ahead and start with that. In terms of foreign policy, I think in many ways, Biden has been about what you might expect, because he appointed a lot of old hands, many of them from the Obama administration. And what we don't see is actually a big push on any kind of new foreign policy initiatives. He seems to be investing most of his political capital in domestic politics. So it's not too surprising on that front. It's in many ways about what we would expect. If you're a progressive, you're probably a little disappointed. If you're kind of moderate, you're maybe not too surprised one way or the other. If you're a conservative, you might be a little nervous that Biden is maybe dropping some of Trump's agenda in terms of a focus on trade wars and maybe getting tough on allies and military spending, that type of thing. So on foreign policy, there's not much to say. And in fact, it's actually been relatively quiet, more than I expected.
I'll jump in and say that's the similar impression to what I have in terms of it being quiet. When I was thinking about the time that's passed so far, it seems to me that the focus has been almost exclusively on the vaccine rollout and getting people vaccinated. It's been a very public health concern focused administration. And in some ways, it surprises me given all of the other fairly significant issues that the country faces at the present time. So I'm talking about immigration. You could look at what's happening at the border, look at the long lines that are forming, the children that are in overcrowded conditions from what we understand. And you could say, well, there's an immigration crisis. What is the administration doing about immigration? I think that you could also look at rights-based advocacy and think about Black Lives Matter. We've got the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin trial going on right now regarding the death of George Floyd, and we still have a great deal of momentum. Some cities around the country still have people that are gathering on a fairly regular basis to demonstrate and demand their rights, demand constitutional treatment, respect along the lines of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so I think very much there are demands for rights that continue to be something that's pressing as an issue in the streets. And you look at the administration and you say, what's really happened? What's the plan? What sorts of policy initiatives are going to be adopted moving forward? And so in many ways, I look at the first 100 days of the Biden administration and I say, beyond the vaccine, is anything else really going on, and what are the policy directions shaping up to look like? And I think it's a little bit enigmatic at this point still. We don't really know what comes next beyond the vaccine in some ways.
All right. Sort of following along with Dr. Williams, I was thinking about, President Biden came in as the oldest president in our history, and I was struck by some of the ways in which his first days in office have dealt with children in different lights. So I sort of have 4 points. First, looking at the border, it looks like part of his legacy will be how does he deal with the unaccompanied minors that are coming, showing up at the border, and how does he handle that issue? The piece of legislation that just came through that gave more money, more COVID relief money to a lot of families, also included a provision which we'll start to see in July, allowing families that have small children to recover child tax credits, receive monthly payments for their children if they're lower to middle class. And I think that's a potentially landmark policy that he got through in his first 100 days. In graduate school, I knew some Canadians who had experienced a similar policy, and we haven't really seen anything quite like that in America before, not in this way, a direct deposit into your banking account. There is also the concern that's growing about how quickly schools are reopening. We haven't had that be as much of an issue here in Florida, but I have friends around the country, and they have experienced different responses from their state and local leaders. And so anyway, and then finally, Biden's own children, Hunter Biden, has been a sort of a potential unknown. He's been treated in different ways by the press, but that could be a liability for him moving forward. We'll see. But anyways, I'm thinking about the very old Biden, and as a transition presidency, looking at the much younger generation right now.
Dr. Cayton, did you have anything to add? Any surprises for you from the first 100 days thus far?
I can't think of any big surprises, really. I mean, it's so early in the presidency. I mainly have unanswered questions at this point. Maybe they'll turn into surprises later, or maybe they won't. Fair
enough. Let's ask a follow-up question here for Dr. Shively. Of course, being an IR guy, I'm definitely going to be partial to foreign policy. And you noted the consistency we've seen thus far with President Biden. And I'm curious as to whether or not you think that is going to stay that way. Is maybe President Biden's more focused on the domestic policy arenas and doesn't sort of have the leeway to sort of change much in terms of foreign policy? Or is this pretty much what we should expect here, is mostly consistency?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Typically, presidents have a lot more leeway on domestic politics, and over time, they tend to focus more on foreign policy because they don't have to deal with Congress as much. So it may be that the Biden administration is thinking in political science terms, right, in terms of political capital, and that they're going to focus on domestic issues now and then shift gears later. It may be, though, that Biden himself, as Professor Ramsey said, is older, and his formative experience is really in the Cold War and the late 20th century. So his view of foreign policy after Trump in particular seems to be that he wants to get back to some kind of baseline U.S. leadership in the world. Now, for those who tuned in a couple weeks ago for the discussion about grand strategy, I made the argument there that Biden seems to be trying to return to some kind of mean U.S. foreign policy where it's a focus on internationalism, rebuilding U.S. alliances, maybe focusing on trade, but not building new trade deals. So again, nothing earth-shattering, but I think in the view of his advisors and himself, what he wants to do is completely change the tenor of U.S. foreign policy after Trump. So maybe in his mind, that is a dramatic change. The only other thing I'll say here is that in general, I think, as Dr. Williams suggested, the administration seems to be a little uncertain how to respond to a crisis on the border because they hadn't prepared for that, but they're doing very well with things that they had prepared for. So on foreign policy, we have to wait and see how they respond to a major crisis, and they haven't really had anything significant on that front yet.
Can I jump in, Dr. Kreischer? I'm particularly intrigued, even though it's much more an area for Dr. Shively and Kreischer, but in Biden's foreign policy changes, because on the one hand, he's trying to return to some continuity with the Obama administration. He's getting back in the Paris Accords, back in the Iran nuclear deal, back in the WHO, and repairing some frayed relationships with NATO. But as the saying goes, you can never step in the same river twice. So the situation with Iran is different than it was when the Iran deal was struck. The COVID has changed has not exactly covered the World Health Organization in glory in some ways. And so there are still some tough questions to answer, I think. But one other thing that strikes me is that of all of the Democrats in the Obama administration, Biden strikes me as the one that was in many ways the least different from Trump, in that Biden was skeptical of foreign policy intervention like Trump was. Biden was in favor of being tougher on China in a number of ways like Trump. So even though there's great concern among Republicans that Trump's defeat is going to be an advantage to China, they might have gotten the Democrat that is not the same, but certainly more similar than a lot of his competition was. So I'm really interested to see how he squares his attempts to return to Obama-era policies with his fairly well publicized at the time differences that were, a step or two in Trump's direction from Obama. I don't know how that's going to play out, but I'm fascinated by it.
All right. I love talking about foreign policy. We do have some questions here about the economy. We saw the sort of crown jewel of the first 100 days so far, the large stimulus spending package. But that seems to only be the beginning. And I think we have a couple questions here. One is, right, we're starting to see maybe more ambitious plans in the mix, particularly Biden's Americans Jobs Plan. In many ways, again, we're seeing a little bit of continuity with President Trump. And so if we think about, who do we think would benefit and lose with Biden's sort of shift on the Americans Jobs Plan? So in terms of his sort of economic vision, who do we think is going to benefit and who might have the most to lose from his shift in economics?
I'll jump in and say that one of the things that has completely baffled me politically in recent years, maybe even up to the past decade, is the fact that I feel like no matter which party you're representing, you're willing to spend a lot more money than people used to be willing to spend, depending on your partisan alignment. And there was a time when balancing the budget was a top priority. And it seems like no matter what your stripe right now, spending money strategically to support people is not a wrong way to go, no matter which party you're representing. And I think that that's a global phenomenon, actually, or at least across advanced industrial countries. Parties of the right, which might have traditionally touted a balanced budget agenda, are talking about what can we do for the working class poor? How can we support people? How can we bring jobs? And even if that means injecting money into the economy, going into deficit spending to do so, we're willing to do that. So expansion of the budget seems to be something that we saw in the Trump administration. And I think it's something that we expected to see with the Biden administration, because the Biden administration is coming from a left of center perspective. Ideologically, they should be the party that looks more like a big government party. So infrastructure bill, that's not too surprising. You know, build roads, get people back to work, have the federal government create jobs in order to get people back to work. I think those are out of the playbook of what we would have expected. But I think the question mark that remains for the Biden administration is how far in that direction are they going to go? And so when we have people who were skeptical of putting someone from a left of center party into office in this election, one of the things that was often talked about is, are we going to become a socialist country? And socialist was a word that was used in that sense of expansion of the government beyond anything that we could possibly imagine. And so as we look at the Biden administration, I think it's interesting to ask, is this something that would have been done regardless of party stripes? Would we have seen an injection in the economy, an injection of capital, whether that comes in the form of tax rebates or whether that comes in the form of an infrastructure bill? Would we have seen deficit spending exponentially growing no matter which administration we had? And then beyond that, are we going to see something that looks like a much heavier, substantial growth of government spending on social programs as the result of the Biden administration? And I think that remains to be seen.
If I could add maybe a way to think about framing this, one way is to think that Biden is much more progressive on some issues than he normally would have been. The common argument is that he, no matter what, he's always squarely in the center of the consensus of the Democratic Party. So in that sense, he's different than he would have been 30 years ago, but he's right in the center of where most Democrats are thinking. But in terms of, as Dr. Williams is talking about, like, is this a dramatic change that he's pushing forward on the level of like LBJ and the Great Society or something like that? Potentially, right? Or another way to think about it is that, depending on how you look at the Great Society, for example, this is a correction back towards some mean. So, you know, the US was drifting in one more conservative direction, and now there's a kind of over, depending on how you view it, overcorrection or just a correction back toward some kind of mean. I don't know how to, frame that, and that's probably up to where you stand politically, but it is worth thinking about how you read what the Biden administration is doing here. Is it really dramatically different and new, or is it dramatically different and new, but in a way that was inevitable no matter what?
Might we believe that President Biden will push for legislation like the PRO Act to try and revitalize labor unions, to try and sort of rebuild a constituency in the recapturing the blue wall state? So might that be part of his sort of new economic focus to sort of revitalize labor unions?
Yes. There's a pattern that precedes recent history of presidents disproportionately targeting at least the policy that's under their executive discretion, to battleground states and to states that supported them in the previous election. And President Trump was, I mean, he came right out and said it a lot more than other presidents did, that he wasn't going to help California with this or that because they didn't like him. But that's a pattern that's fairly persistent across American history. And certainly when there's an electoral incentive, if you're anybody looking at the Electoral College map, you need to keep the upper Midwest and Georgia and Arizona in the Democratic column. If you're a Republican, you need to win them. And people tend to support the party in power when they're becoming better off. So absolutely, he has an incentive to do that.
And I would just add, the left has made a tremendous mistake, I think, that is going to need correction if the left is going to sustain itself as an ideological group, as a political party. And so the United States Democratic Party, again, not alone in the world, it's happening to lots of other advanced industrial countries. They're shrugging their shoulders and saying, who's representing the working class? But to kind of steer that in the direction of the question, I think labor unions are going to be important for somebody to carve out a relationship with. And historically, it makes much more sense for this to be coming from the left, to come from the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party has become largely a middle-class party in some ways. And then you combine progressive values and it's become the party of young people. It's become the party of college-educated people. It's become the party of certain upwardly mobile elites in the country. And at the same time, the shape of the Republican Party has changed so dramatically that the Republican Party has been able to attract disenfranchised labor unionites of a bygone era, or at least in the 2016 election, that was an important part of winning the Rust Belt and getting the former auto workers and the steel workers of Pennsylvania on your side. And so that's going to continue to be something. We saw it play out in the 2020 election, but we're going to see it play out again in 2024. And so the left, the Democrats, are going to have to figure out if they still have a relationship with the labor unions, and if so, how can they remake it? And meanwhile, know that the right is interested in taking some of those disenfranchised labor unionists away from them.
I guess one of the I'm looking at a couple of, variables. Keep in mind, one thing that we've inherited a couple of years ago was when the tax code changed, state and local tax deductions were capped. And so we had some states where wealthy individuals were essentially paying their tax dollars to their local governments, their state governments, and then they got a big tax break from the federal government because there wasn't double taxation going on. And we sort of I expected that it would be part of policy when the Democrats came in, that they would remove that cap on state and local tax deductions. Certainly, it's gotten the attention of Speaker Pelosi that this needs to be a priority, but Biden has signaled so far he's not interested in seeing a return or in removing that cap. And so we might see some resettlement patterns as wealth moves out of blue states towards red states where there's no incentive anymore to stay in and contribute your high tax rates and then also pay high federal tax rates. The other one I'm sort of looking at is if a lot of small businesses end up folding at the end of COVID, once we're back into a normal period again, if what we see is that a number of small businesses simply took too hard of a hit and they can't get up and running again, that is a fairly important swing demographic. And so where do they throw their energy? Which party do they side with? Because there could be new impetus to revive antitrust legislation or to attack bigness again and to stoke fires of, if Trump tapped into populism, this is always a possibility that lies around in America, that the power of the government could be used to break up large concentrations of wealth. And in the past, we've thought of that as a progressive or a liberal, a democratic thing to do. But Teddy Roosevelt was a trust buster, and he was a Republican. And so it may be that, and I saw just yesterday, senators like Rubio and are talking about if they're going to take the All-Star game away from Georgia, then maybe we should revisit the antitrust exemption of professional sports, of Major League Baseball. It's funny to me to watch these stalwarts of the Republican Party try to talk the language of populism, but that's what happens during party realignments. Is your core issues, the things that unite your party, aren't what they were in the past, and you have to either learn to speak the new talk, or you no longer matter to the party, and new figures arise who can talk the new talk and appeal to a new generation of voters. So that's sort of what I'm keeping my eyes on right now.
Yeah, I'm watching that too, Dr. Ramsey. I have been totally interested in that, and I'm, I guess, mostly going to piggyback on what you have said, but it strikes me that what's been a fairly small movement in the electorate, which initially made me pretty skeptical of realignment talk, is leading to bigger changes in the policy discussion than I would have expected. I mean, in 2016, the election was decided by a shift of a relatively small number of Democratic voters in upper Midwestern states. In terms of a percentage of Democrats who voted for Trump, it was a very small percentage, and it was no bigger than usual. And Clinton and then Biden picked up a little bit of Republican support to compensate for it, but it mattered where it was. It just tipped those supposedly blue wall states into Trump's column, and it seems like the specter of seeing those states turn red for Democrats and keeping those states red for Republicans has led to this realignment you were talking about, where Republicans are making a big play for the working class in a way that they really haven't. I mean, even growing up, I heard much more about the middle class than the working class. There wasn't much working class talk even in the political discussion in the 90s and the 2000s. It was all middle class families. And now it's much more about the working class in both parties. And I'm seeing, I suspect the Republican play for the working class is going to cause the Democrats to try to counter it. But I'm also interested in seeing what the relationships of the parties to businesses, because like you were saying, Dr. Ramsey, the Republicans have, from the founding of the party, been the party that's had the most support from the country's largest corporations. And they've very deliberately, self-consciously been the party of big business. And I'm seeing a headline today, Mitch McConnell, big business acting like woke parallel government. And I'm seeing, very serious talk about the political power that Twitter and Facebook, the disproportionate power they play in the political discourse by deciding who can post and who can't. And what strikes me about that is that what I'm hearing Republicans say about this sounds like populist party talk from the 1890s. It sounds like progressive talk now, where if I can just imagine interactions in the Senate where Ted Cruz is saying, don't you realize that concentrations of wealth lead to concentrations of political power? And Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders saying, well, yeah, that's what we've been going on about. And so I'm not sure where that ends up. It's totally fascinating to me to watch. I don't think the country's politicians or the country's businesses know how to navigate it. So it's really interesting to watch.
Sort of a follow-on to this, sort of talking about support for the different parties. We have a question here about one of the things that helped Biden win election was sort of campaigning off the momentum for a push towards social and political change, resulting from some of the stuff we saw last summer. Was this just politics? Was this performative acts? Or should we expect Biden to sort of pursue policy to actually deal with some of the problems we've seen, or, was it just a way to win election?
Wow, that's a great question. I hate to be the first, but maybe you'll be generous if I'm the first to try to take a stab at that one. was it just politics? I think it needs to be so much more than politics if you are the Democratic Party. Those are the core issues in terms of social values that should be the defining issues of the progressive Democratic Party. And I think that from the 1980s, from the sort of post-materialist shift in political parties and sort of what defines political party core ideology, for the left of center parties, for the Democratic Party, it's been all about rights, and it's been something that from the movements of the 1960s has sort of made the shape of party ideology what it is today. And so for the Democratic Party to drop the ball at this point, when we haven't seen social movements of a civil rights nature since the 1960s until this point in time, it's bubbled up and they have to address it. And I think fundamentally for them to fail to do so would be a failure of sort of being true to who they are representing, for being true to who they are ideologically. So I'm watching for them to come forward with something that addresses the current polarization, that addresses civil rights problems throughout the country. I think something that fascinated me was watching the legislation that's been moving forward through Georgia, restricting or potentially restricting voting rights, and seeing the administration not have terribly much to say about it. Seeing members of Congress not have terribly much to say about it. I mean, they've been talking about it, sure. They've been condemning it somewhat, but it seems like at a moment in time like this, when civil rights became the issue of last summer, alongside COVID, but it certainly had its day and many days. I think for the Biden administration to not have some sort of plan and take some sort of decisive action to try to build bridges would be a failure of the Democratic Party at this point in time. So I'm watching for it.
You know, following on that, I do think that the administration tried to make at least a visibly symbolic effort to have a very diverse cabinet and to appoint a lot of different types of people from different backgrounds throughout the administration. So politically, it's clear that they take this seriously. It may be, though, that they've just set of priorities, and as important as that is to the country and to the party, it seems that it falls, 3 or 4 on the list after COVID and some economic programs. The challenge is once you get past this 100 days, your political capital is continuing to diminish. So do they then have a kind of agenda after infrastructure, for example, to deal with these kinds of issues, or is it more episodic where as things arise, they comment on them? So yeah, again, you have to watch it. My read is that they've just they've got a list of priorities, and that for whatever reason they decided is on the list, but not at the top.
Yeah, one of the things I'm looking at is, Biden's waited a long time to give a State of the Union address. I haven't seen any plans about that. But that is a regular, tradition, something sort of ordained by the Constitution, a moment for the president to address the legislative branch, but also the country as a whole. And since eyes are turned on the presidency, it can be a moment to extend the olive branch, to try to unify the country, to lay out a vision for a common path forward. And if I were counseling Biden, I'd have him go back and look at Jefferson's first inaugural and the way that he approached a very divided government after a contentious election when it wasn't clear, whether he or Aaron Burr should have been president, and the way that he sort of laid out what his principles would be and talked about how to treat dissenters within the country and these federalists who had fought so hard to kill his party off with alien and sedition acts. So there's just a lot that could be done. Presidents have a huge rhetorical advantage to craft a vision of unity and consensus government. I don't know if we've seen that Biden's going to rise to the occasion for that sort of thing, but there's certainly an opportunity for it, I think, with the State of the Union address.
What does this maybe suggest moving forward? Maybe not thinking just about his first 100 days, but maybe first year or two leading into the 2022 elections. With this, the big stimulus bill that we just saw a while ago, is that it? Is that going to be the top? Is there nowhere to go but down? Should we expect other major pieces of legislation, or have we really seen the peak?
Probably shouldn't expect them. That doesn't mean they won't happen. But the Biden administration is, I think, doing a clear-eyed job of addressing the political reality of this moment, which is that they will not get 60 votes in the Senate for anything. Full stop. It is not going to happen. At least nothing major, nothing defining. I mean, there will be like defense reauthorizations. There will be some other important but less high-profile legislation. But as far as major initiatives, President Biden can't count on substantial Republican support for the simple reason that the party that does not have, so bipartisanship is a resource controlled by the minority party. And so the party out of power has no incentive to make the president of the other party look like they did a good job reaching out to them, because bipartisanship reflects better on the president than it does on the minority party in the Senate. So politically, there will be nothing that's on the top of Biden's agenda is going to get 10 Republican votes. So what previous presidents have done, Trump and Obama included, and they're the two that really more than any others faced this situation, was they have tried to get something through to clear the filibuster in the Senate on a bipartisan basis. They have often failed to do so. This was the story with healthcare bills under the Trump administration. It was the story of the Affordable Care Act. And then as a last resort, use the Senate reconciliation process, which is a process that allows the Senate to pass legislation dealing with taxes and spending with a simple majority that's not subject to a filibuster, as a way to make the budget process in the Senate faster. So what it seems like the Biden administration is doing is just taking it as a given, instead of trying to clear the filibuster, taking it as a given that they're not going to be able to do that. And so instead, they're cramming as much as they possibly can into reconciliation worthy or reconciliation qualifying bills. Now, the thing about reconciliation is you can only pass 3 reconciliation bills a year at most, one dealing with revenue, one dealing with spending, and one dealing with the debt ceiling. So that means looking at the calendar, so it's 2021, there's 2022, and there's an election in 2022. That means the Biden administration is going to be able to pass between 2 and 6 reconciliation bills. And just the political reality being what it is, their high-profile agenda items are going to have to be in those bills. Otherwise, they're not going to clear the filibuster. And so I think that's why we're seeing this COVID relief bill, which was massive, and then this new infrastructure bill, which is massive and includes a number of different priorities. If it were enacted as 10 different bills, you'd say, wow, that's like Roosevelt's first 100 days. You enact it as one bill, we're saying, whoa, it's just one bill. What else is he going to do? But it's a strategy that is bending to the combination of polarization and Senate procedure, which seems to increasingly rule everyone's lives in Washington, D.C.
As the other institutionalist on the panel, I think I want to jump in for a second and say that Dr. Cayton's point about the institutional reality of what we're facing in terms of very slim majorities on either side is important to keep in mind, because the American system is known as a grinding, slow, deliberative government. When we think of governments around the world and the speed in which decision-making or sweeping change happens, America's legislative politics, America's separation of powers, institutional context makes it one of the slowest and the worst at effecting grand sweeping changes. And so what we hope for typically in the American context is that we don't need a lot of change. And historically, we have one of the longest continuous democracies, the longest continuous democracy in the world. And so we haven't had to overthrow the system and start from scratch. We've been able to come through periods of partisan realignment and adjust policies accordingly through that process whenever something really big needs to change. But overall, this system relies on consensus building. It relies on people being able to come together in the legislative body and working with the president to get things done that need to be done. But quite frankly, when I think of the American system, it's one where you hope that you don't need things to change too dramatically too quickly.
Can I ask a question then from the other panelists? There's been a lot of talk of the changing the filibuster, either turning it into an actual talking filibuster again or throwing it out completely, which it's not in the Constitution, so you could do that, and or doing something dramatic like adding DC as a state, maybe looking at Puerto Rico as well. The administration seems to have entertained those ideas. They seem like they're still on tap potentially. Do you think that's likely? My own read is, I don't know, actually 50-50. It seems like if there was a time those were going to happen, this would be it. But that's pretty dramatic, and Biden himself likes the Senate as it is. So that's hard to read. What do you think?
I can answer it, but I want to give somebody else the chance to. The statehood for DC and Puerto Rico depend on the filibuster, because that is not something that could be construed as primarily about revenue or spending. So even though there's of course a revenue and spending component to it, so you couldn't do that through reconciliation. It would have to go through the regular rules of the Senate. So those bills would either need to get 10 Republican votes in a cloture motion, or the filibuster would have to be abolished. So I'd say filibuster probably comes first, unless we can find a likely Republican state to add to the Union somewhere. Maybe we split East and West Kansas, anyone? How about that? Although maybe, well, anyway, I'm musing about the electoral geography of Kansas, which I will not do in front of 130 people. As far as removing the filibuster, I doubt it. One, I don't think there are 50 votes to do it. I don't think Manchin wants to do it. I don't think a number of other Democrats want to do it. Two, I think some reforms maybe are on the table that would allow Manchin and others to say, this isn't killing the filibuster, this is reforming it, this is making it work a more productive way. That's certainly possible. The one thing I have my eyes on is Republican retaliation to that. So the Senate is in a period, and really our government is in a period of procedural warfare, where rules are being changed in a strategic way, which always happens, but it's currently happening very quickly. We're seeing this with discussions about expanding the size of the Supreme Court, discussions of getting rid of the filibuster, discussions of adding states, discussions about who actually has the power to pick electors to the Electoral College. It's sort of on the table to change the rules right now in a way that it typically isn't. So the question Democrats should ask themselves is, if they get rid of the filibuster, what happens the next day? What happens the next year? And the Senate, and I don't want to spend too much time on Senate procedure. It would be fun for me, but I don't know how much fun it would be for the rest of you. But there is still a tremendous amount the minority party can do in the Senate to make life there impossible, even if the filibuster is gone. The Senate's routine business, such as when to adjourn for the day, when to reconvene, and when to consider just basic non-controversial legislation, is done by unanimous consent agreement. And the word unanimous means unanimous. Every senator has to agree to make the Senate operate on a daily basis. So even though there's this major polarization in the Senate, they still function on a daily basis by truly unanimous consent, meaning Republicans and Democrats agree on what bills to bring to the floor, when to adjourn, when to adjourn for elections, when to start holidays, when to come back, and a million other things. Mitch McConnell said if the Democrats get rid of the filibuster, we will never give unanimous consent again for anything, which would mean the Democrats would have to not only get rid of the filibuster, they would have to completely rewrite Senate rules to come up with another way of doing business to get around the lack of agreement to unanimous consent. I'm not sure they're prepared to do that. I hope they're thinking it through because if they get rid of the filibuster, they need to be prepared to completely rewrite the rules.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that? Dr. Ramsey?
I remember a time when political scientists were losing out in the public commentary market to economists, and Professor Cayton's his comments there reminded me it's a good time right now to be a political scientist. That's all. That all of these kinds of issues are bread and butter, and these are exciting times to study the science of politics.
And economists used to be really certain what the effects of deficits were, and they're not sure about that anymore. We're running the experiment, so we'll tell them, but they don't know anymore either. So I'm with Dr. Ramsey. Yay, us.
Let's continue along this sort of same train of thought, speaking of sort of institutions and how to get things done. So, all right, filibuster is probably going to stick around. We're going to have issues with the filibuster and getting 10 Republican votes. President Biden came in signing an awful lot of executive orders right off the bat. Is this how things are going to get done? If he runs into roadblocks, is it just going to start using a lot more executive orders for something like, I don't know, student debt, which a lot of people in this room care about right now? So could we start to see more flexing of the executive order, which he's already flexed quite a bit?
Yes.
I'll jump in and say that when I look at other presidential democracies around the world, that is how it's done when there's a stalemate. France is a country that I study very carefully, and the way that things change in France largely and for a long time has been through presidential decree. And so we haven't seen that as much in the United States, but I think one of the lessons of the past year, several years, has been, as Dr. Cayton suggested, the rules, bending the rules, changing the rules, the focus on what does the rule book say has never been something that has been so central, because we had operated for such a long period of time on a normative basis, really, for what democracy looks like and how we treat one another in the legislative culture and within the hallways of government. And very much we've seen that shift in a direction where people are looking at what they can get away with, what the unwritten rules are, what's the penalty for breaking the rules, how likely is it that I'm going to be prosecuted for the penalty of breaking the rule if I break it. And that's a completely different way of thinking about how to accomplish the business of government. But I think in terms of rule by decree, it sounds like something that you wouldn't expect to see in a democracy, but we do have precedents in other presidential systems where when there is deep division within the legislature, and yet there are public interests and public policy areas where solutions are needed, where people need aid, where support is required, where action needs to be taken to get the day-to-day interests of the people met, I think that you could potentially see more of the use of the decree. And just because it's fairly new in the American system, or we don't use it as often as other presidential democracies, we certainly could.
I agree with that. The presidents are using executive orders more and more, and in part because polarization is leading to more obstruction, but in part because with the growth of the federal bureaucracy since the New Deal, since the 100 days was invented, there are just more things they can give executive orders about because they've been given more authority by Congress. So it's worth keeping in mind that if the president exceeds what we think of as their power, it's because mostly Congress allows them to do it by writing bills that say the president shall decide, the president shall direct, and then they can decide and direct. But executive orders are interesting because supposedly the president can't issue an executive order that violates the law or the Constitution. In reality, that has to be sorted out by the courts. So you have the fastest moving branch of government being chased by the slowest moving branch of government, which means executive orders are always, if they break the law, they're being enforced at least for a little while before they're stopped. Once that happens, one, it lets them get away with a policy change for a while, get away with or enjoy it for a while. And then two, even if it gets blocked by the courts eventually, sometimes it moves the policy debate by creating a new issue. We saw this with President Obama's executive orders over the DREAM Act. Dreamers came forward and gave their information to be protected from deportation, and without Congress passing a law about it. And the question shifts from, is that constitutional or not, to, well, now if you take this away or enforce immigration laws against these people, you're doing them a harm when they were following the law coming forward. So it completely changes the policy conversation. So it's it's really consequential even when it's temporary for presidents to use executive orders. And the party that doesn't have the White House is always indignant about presidents using executive orders, but this is standard practice.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I'd rate, we're coming out of a presidency where the president was impeached twice, and so very much in the sights of the legislative branch. And so while I agree with the characterization, we're seeing a rise with each administration in the number of executive orders, but there does seem to be some public perception that this is illegitimate, that it's not the way it's supposed to work. That there was something funny about the Iran deal, for example, because senates are supposed to approve of treaties, right? So what is this executive agreement we're coming to? How is that working? Or when it comes to the Dreamers and how DACA was arranged, that it would have looked more legitimate if a president had engaged with Congress and worked to get something that passed both houses with majorities and then came for a signature. And so if a I just wonder, it's strange to think about an executive faced with a Congress that can't get much done because of a very clear division or a difficult numbers game, that would then resort to executive order, having seen his predecessor impeached twice. That's a weird institutional moment, I suppose, because there should be a clear reminder that, presidents can be removed suddenly by the legislative branch. I guess the lesson might be this, that if you impeach but don't remove, it may embolden presidents. If you frequently resort to impeachment as a discipline measure that doesn't take, it may not actually check the independence of the executive very well at all. So, thoughts about the whole dynamic there.
All right, I want to push maybe into an area we haven't really hit on tonight, and we haven't heard too much about, and this is the judiciary. We have seen some Supreme Court rulings come down, but that's not quite what we got a question about. Thinking about President Biden filling court vacancies. We have heard a little bit here lately about his plans for filling court vacancies, particularly utilizing more minority judges. So what's it look like in terms of President Biden filling these court vacancies? Is he going to be able to get a court system he likes, or is he pretty pretty much hamstrung by what the courts look like already?
Well, we'll see. I didn't I didn't see the appointment process going the way it did under Trump. You know, I couldn't have called that. And you know, the difficulties that Professor Cayton's mentioned about decisions coming out of the Senate are going to be with Biden there on court appointments as well. You know, the court's slow in just about every way, including the personnel process. It's slow to turn over. And Trump was sort of a beast when it came to filling vacancies. You know, he set up a machine and McConnell helped him out. So there just aren't going to be as many as there were for Trump, which means it's going to be slow to turn over. The one resource that is sort of left to Biden and the Democrats is to, you know, create new district courts, new circuit courts, and expand the judiciary. And that's totally within it's totally prerogative of Congress working with the president to make those sorts of changes. But again, I'm not sure that I see the numbers showing up. The Senate's going to be a sticking point probably on that. And on that, I guess maybe Biden didn't help his case too much. When he was pressed to give an answer to that question, he said, "We'll wait and see." During the debates before the election, he could have given himself a little more of a mandate if he'd said what he planned to do when it came to personnel on the court. Would he back expanding the size of the court? And he didn't commit one way or the other. To my knowledge, I didn't read that comment. So it remains, it's one of those known unknowns, I suppose.
All right, we're getting down to the last couple questions here. So one of the things, a consistent sort of pattern across all your answers is stuff you're looking for. So thinking of sort of projecting beyond President Biden's first 100 days, let's move away from what you're looking for. Let's talk about what you're expecting. All right, so based upon what you've seen thus far, what are you expecting leading into the next round of elections? You know, is it status quo, slow going, punctuated by, you know, an occasional surprise, or, you know, or do you expect sort of the momentum of the first 100 days to carry on? So not what you're looking for, what do you expect moving forward?
I expect, I guess I'll divide it in two. Like, as I said, on foreign policy, I would expect to see the administration continuing to slowly ratchet up some of their pressure on China, for example, to maybe push some of these other issues like the Iran nuclear deal that they had been talking about. Climate change was a big thing rhetorically that they talked about, and the Paris Climate Agreement. So, you know, we may expect to see those particular issues in foreign affairs continuing to move it forward slowly, but based on the type of people that Biden has appointed, it seems like he's more interested in a kind of stable approach rather than one driven by, you know, big changes. The other thing domestically then to keep in mind, and the others can probably speak to this more than me, is what calculations are they making about what they can push through this first year? My guess is most of the action on any kind of thing that they think may be unpopular or controversial, if they're smart, they'll do it this year so that next year they can cross their fingers and hope that there's an economic recovery that starts this year and continues to roll through next year. Because typically the party in the White House will lose seats in Congress during the midterm. So they got to figure out conditions that they can set up for next year. And that's usually an economic plan. That's usually the levers that the president has available. So do they have unpopular things? You know, like we're talking about migrants right now. If next year, that'll be ancient history probably, unless it happens again, right? This is a seasonal thing, in which case then they really have a problem. So that's the clock that they're on, is probably midterms when it comes to domestic politics.
I'll give a shot at an answer here, and that is when we look at recent presidencies, and honestly, most presidencies, we've sort of given a misleading title to this presentation because FDR's presidency was singular. The moment he came to power, the fact that he won 4 elections, the amount of time he served, the advantages he was given on the court, but not so much the court, but in both houses of Congress. That there was sort of a unique moment there. But mostly the president handles the unanticipated. When you look at the function of the executive in the Constitution, you're there. I think George W. Bush said, "I'm the decider," right? He had a way of sort of putting it in one word, like, I'm the person who decides. You respond to what's going on in the moment. And that's a very important function. The president is the one officer of the government that doesn't come into being and pass away, right? Doesn't come into session and then retire, and that's the end of that session. You're on the clock until there's a new president. And so we probably haven't seen the thing that's going to define the Biden presidency yet. It's been sort of no big surprises so far. The question is, what's going to be the happening, the thing that then tests Biden? He surrounded himself with advisors. He's staffed his cabinet, but I'm looking for, and my prediction is going to be, there's something unknown in our future, and it will probably come not domestically, but from abroad, some challenge he'll have to meet. How will he meet that challenge? And here I'm looking at the initial, the recent tests we've seen in the meetings in Alaska with China and Blinken, with Putin sort of, saber rattling or whatever. Let's do a push-up contest. No, let's have a live debate. And now with Iran sort of saying, we don't want to sit down and renegotiate the deal. These are some challenges, but there hasn't been the big thing yet. So I'm sort of looking, and I think there will be a thing that then tests the Biden presidency.
I think in some ways, when I look at Biden, he's exactly what he promised us that he would be throughout much of the election. When I look back at the campaign season and the way that the candidates and the parties squared off against each other, he tried very hard not to take a side in many respects. He tried to be the person who was saying, I can work with both parties and people from both parties. I can bend and flex and compromise better than anybody. I'm a good listener. And so for anyone to expect that he was going to come in guns blazing, policies changing, I think might not have been a reasonable expectation of Joe Biden. We had candidates on the left of center who didn't get selected, didn't get their party's nomination, who were much more progressive, who were talking about grand sweeping changes. And I'm thinking of Bernie Sanders. I'm thinking of Elizabeth Warren. And then we had other moderates, but Biden was chosen, I think, because he was the tried and true tested version of the moderate Democrat. And so he comes into office with a lot of rhetoric about unifying the nation. I've been thinking a lot lately about, are you a Declaration of Independence American or are you a Constitutional Convention American? And the reason for that is I think Joe Biden represents the we, the people, the unifying moment of the nation. We've set aside differences, and what we want to talk about is common values and common goals, and where can we go together and what do we all have in common? And so when we watch how he's taken steps in that direction and think about the things that he's done, even beginning from his inauguration day, as others have mentioned, it was so much about how to bring people together. And then in terms of staffing positions within his administration, he was thinking about how to get diversity, but also how to get people with different perspectives coming together. And even though he may not have, maybe no one has the ability to bring real bipartisan legislation right now, I think that that's something that deep in his heart of hearts, he believes if he is careful, if he's patient, I think he believes he will eventually be the bipartisan president, because he's talked a lot about how he reaches across the aisles and throughout his long political career has been able to talk to people that he doesn't agree with and listen and gain their confidence and maybe gain some of their support if he just doesn't do anything too dramatic. And so I think this is perhaps his playbook, and this may be a really long slog to see if it's effective in the end, but I think he's laying that groundwork. And I feel a little Alexis de Tocqueville in some moments lately, because as a Frenchman studying America, de Tocqueville talked about how he always had France in the back of his mind. And when I'm looking at America these days, I have France in the back of my mind quite a bit. But I think about Emmanuel Macron in France, and I think about the similarities because in many ways he came in with some elements of populism saying, I don't represent a political party, I represent all people. He disassociated with his political party in the season of campaigning, and he founded his own movement, he called it. And he said, I'm going to put people who are socialists in my cabinet. I'm also going to put people from the traditional, Gaullist right of center in my cabinet. And I'm going to talk about issues, and I'm going to represent all people. And I look at Joe Biden and I see similar strategies. I think the danger is because we now have Emmanuel Macron many years ahead of where Joe Biden is in terms of time in office, coming up on toward the end of his term. And it hasn't worked especially well to get things done. He has lost a lot of support from both the people in his traditional party and in the party that he courted as partners through all of this. It looks like people are ready for a bit of a return to partisanship in France, and they felt like he didn't take enough of a side, and yet he also didn't accomplish as much as they had hoped. And so I think the question for Biden will be, and the interesting thing to watch is, can we wait long enough to see his patience and his listening and his bridge building pay off in terms of truly being able to accomplish bringing both the American people together and members of elected office together, reaching across the aisles? That's a really heavy lift. Can we wait long enough to see that happen? And if we do, will we see policies that are consensual, but also address some of the current problems that this country faces?
My prediction is that on the domestic front, I believe that this is the peak of the presidency. And I'll go out on a limb and make a prediction. Let the future prove me wrong. I think the Biden administration is clear-eyed about their margin and the calendar in a way that other ones aren't. They're governing as though, so this is a party that has a margin of 9 House of Representatives and a margin of 0 in the Senate. It's a tie. And I think rather than thinking like a lot of presidents have done, what can we enact early to build momentum for something else, and then failing to do that in Trump and Obama's cases and many other presidents as well. I think the Biden administration is just saying, okay, this is our shot and we're going to lose both chambers of Congress in 2 years, so what can we do? And I think they're governing like there is no, never mind second term, they're governing like there is no after the midterms. And so I think what's going to be interesting to see, if I'm right about that strategy, is how it's going to work. They're hoping to enact some major policies and then keep the White House long enough for those policies to be implemented and then have them be difficult to repeal. Just like the Affordable Care Act was impossible, in fact, for the Republicans to repeal, even though they promised to, because doing so was unpopular. I think the Biden administration is going to do the same thing. Get some things enacted into law, hold the ball until they take effect, and then wait for them to become popular. Hey, maybe that even has the effect of helping them keep the House and Senate in the next election if they do that, if they follow that strategy. But even if it doesn't, they've accomplished some stuff. And I think they're just, my take is that that's the strategy, which is actually a kind of an interesting departure from previous administrations.
All right, well, on that, Believe it or not, we have come to the end of our time here this evening. Time really does fly when you're having fun. It turned out it was a very nice question to end our discussion on tonight. Special thanks to all of our panel members for their great discussion. Special thanks to all of the folks that submitted questions. These were some phenomenal questions. I appreciate it. Again, apologies for not getting to all of them. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope the rest of your evening goes lovely, and hopefully we'll see you for our next event. Thank you, everybody.